afraid to show you guys when stuff doesn't always work out or when something just happens. And keep this in mind. When you push something to its limits into areas that are really kind of uncharted territory, you find stuff that kind of gives up. Now, it could be a fluke, but may not, but we'll see. fk8 tuning and development. So, head gaskets. Oh, is my head gasket going to blow? Well, that's not this video. This video is going to be information about head gasket and what could cause it to go. Well, let's start with the factory head gasket. Factory head gaskets are a really good option for somebody who has stock sleeves. Maybe we punch it out a little bit, set up 86 millimeter, 86 and a half. And the factory gasket is designed a certain way for a reason. There's a little slot in the block right where this goes, where coolant passages through here and passes through there. And what this does, it helps keep the gasket cool. When you're dealing with high temperatures, high cylinder pressures, the hottest spot's going to be between the two cylinders. This is your most likely spot to blow a gasket. Now, the other option that you'll have is GE makes a bored out gasket for running that bigger bore. You don't want to run a gasket that can protrude into the cylinder bore, because if the bore is too big and the gasket is too small, and that's basically you'll end up with the gasket and the cylinder, and the heat will go into the gasket and either cause pre-ignition or premature gasket failure. Now, your next option is going to be a kinetic gasket. The kinetic gasket, now it does have this passage here for the coolant, but these are a lot closer, and because, sorry, let me rephrase this. They're not as close to the edge, so the embossment is thicker. And because that embossment is thicker, it's got a better cylinder sealing capability. The last option is a JE Pro Seal, and in the JE Pro Seal, they have what's called a fire ring. This area here where you can see the steel exposed, this is what's called a fire ring, and this is like substituting an O-ring without some of the disadvantages of an O-ring. Well, what's an O-ring? Well, an O-ring is a groove cut in the block where you either feel it with a stainless steel wire or a copper wire. And what this does is it puts additional pressure on the gasket to help seal the combustion in. Once you get carbon tracking, or basically you break that seal in the gasket, right here, you can see some discoloration and carbon tracking. Once you break that seal, or you AKA, well, in some cases, lift the head, which is not what happened here. Well, that was strange. It just, the camera just stopped. And what is not what happened there. And basically, the gasket is not kind of really at fault here. On a sleeve block, there's no passage between the two bores. It's a Siamese bore, so they're right next to each other. So the hottest spot is between those two cylinders. And because of that, that's the most likely point of failure. You know, especially in a scenario where you have a sleeve block, you daily drive it, and you're whooping on it, and making 700 wheel horsepower. It's not the same thing as when you go to the track. And if you go to the track and you're making 800 wheel horsepower, you're going down the track for a couple of seconds and you shut the car down. You're not having those sleeves all already hot and everything else. You're not doing all those extra heat cycles. You're not transferring all that extra heat into the gasket. And basically, kind of what happens here is all that heat transfer, the embossment kind of loses its memory. See, the embossment is what you can see here, what I explained earlier in here, this raised area. That embossment essentially gets flattened out, and then kind of once it loses its memory, you remember you got the motor heat cycle, so you've got the parts expanding, shrinking, and when too much heat ends up in the gasket, it ends up calling it a day, or just too much cylinder pressure. And cylinder pressure, again, is a heat thing. It doesn't matter. Sometimes it doesn't matter. You can run as much fuel in the world in there. You can run whatever fuel you want. You can run methanol, ethanol, all that stuff. That doesn't mean your gasket's going to survive, and it doesn't mean it's going to die either if you don't. You could run a 12:5 air fuel ratio, and then you could run, an 11:5 air fuel ratio. And depending on your fuel, that doesn't again mean that your gas is going to survive, and it doesn't mean it's going to blow either. It's all in testing, and I haven't found anything with a cylinder head as far as warpage. There's no warpage in the cylinder head. There's nothing wrong with the Golden Eagle block. I'm going to chalk this, and this is actually from my car. And keep in mind, and I've said this time and time again, cylinder pressure is not equal to boost pressure. And I've also said that torque is the killer of all things. And running 530 foot-pounds of torque, and the lower in the RPM range that you run it, that's just a lot tougher on the motor, the gasket, and everything else. So I'm going to try the JE Pro Seal. And the reason I'm not going to O-ring the block is I don't want to rip it out of the car. And a fire-ringed gasket, you can't use with an O-ring. So it's not like I can stack this gasket with an O-ring. Now, I could run an O-ring with the Cometic gasket, and I could run an O-ring with a factory gasket. And that would probably do the same thing as the JE Pro Seal gasket here with the fire ring. But the problem is I don't want to deal with picking the O-ring out of the block if it goes again. And if you don't install the O-rings in the block, you literally create a combustion leak. That copper O-ring that you put in, you're supposed to layer it like this. You're not supposed to just cut it and place it down in there. That's wrong, because that's a guaranteed combustion leak. You're supposed to overlay them so that it doesn't, when you press down on the gasket smushes down on the two pieces of copper, and you have a perfect seal. I just want to clarify on the O-ring, when I'm talking about the copper O-ring, how you're supposed to file the edges on an angle. You file the one down and the other one so they lay on top of each other. This way, when the gasket compresses, the copper O-ring, the two ends squish together, and you want that to be perfectly level. And believe me, that's not easy. If you haven't done it before, it's just a very difficult thing to do. So that's why also another reason I want to try to avoid doing O-rings. I'm just not a huge fan of the hassle of O-ringing the block. That's the way I've seen all the builders, told by builders and everything else, and what I've known, that's what I've known and understood. And again, this on my car, I'll chalk this up to just one of those things that happens when you run 30 pounds of boost at 5,000 RPM or between 4,500 and 5,000 RPM. Man, that's a lot of torque. On the Dyno, 25 pounds made 460 foot-pounds of torque at 4,500 RPM. So I don't even know what 30 pounds made at that kind of RPM, but this is what you do when you test. You test, you find the limits, and it wasn't the head, it wasn't the block, it ain't the rods, it ain't the bearings. Then this time the gasket gave up. There was no smoking gun. The cylinder didn't run lean. I didn't run out of methanol. There was no smoking gun, but you got to look at it this way. If it was a 500 cubic inch V8 big block, all right, I would be making 3,000 horsepower at the wheels. So if we do cubic inch versus cubic inch. So I would not expect on an engine like a big block making 3,000 horsepower that a gasket that you just drop in there would hold up without maybe running a copper gasket in an NHRA style fire ring. So am I upset? Heck no. Can we compare this to the K series of old? No, you can't, because this is a totally different engine. So maybe it's just, it needs a fire ring. Maybe it needs an O-ring in the block. Don't know. All I can tell you is I'm going to try the JE Pro Seal, and we'll take it from there. And am I giving up? No, hell no. Because if I gave up, the car would have never made 760. And as far as I know, I can't find another 2 people on the planet besides Luke at 4-piston and one other person that made over 700 wheel on the Type R. And I'm the only one that did it on Honda. So one quick correction, there's one other person, but he blew the gasket clean out of the motor on the first shot. So, yeah. So that makes 3 people on the planet that, besides myself, that made over 700 wheel, and I'm the only person doing it on Flash Pro. So, uncharted territory, ladies and gents. That's where it is. It's kind of uncharted territory, and my car's daily driven, and with the exhaust, with the hood exit, put it back on. Like, again, not an area where other people have been and driven the car like this to this amount. Thank you for tuning in. Hit the like, subscribe, and I love y'all, and take it easy.